Welcome everyone to the Fermentation 101 webinar. Today we are so fortunate to have Dr. Savita Srivastava joining us as an expert, and I will not take up too much time before I pass the narration over to her. Also happy to have Pat Banks, who is Farm Manager and Director of Farming for Allegheny Mountain Institute, here to make a fresh ferment with veggies from our farm. As many of you have heard me say, if you have any questions throughout the class, feel free to use the Zoom chat box to type those questions in, and we will get to answering them as soon as we are able. So with that, I will pass the floor to Savita. Thanks
Hi,
for being
everyone.
here.
I'm Dr. Savita Srivastava. I'm actually one of the gastroenterologists at Augusta Health. And I'd like to thank Grayson and Pat for organizing this workshop in fermentation. It's really an ancient practice in food preservation that really has gotten the attention of scientists and doctors. So I'm going to try to tell the story today about why fermented foods have become such an important part of medical practice for a lot of doctors like me, who not only do gastroenterology, but are also interested in integrative medicine, where we try to focus more on nutrition sciences and understanding how important food is to our overall health and wellness. So as a gastroenterologist who likes to bring ancient principles in gut healing by incorporating concepts like food as medicine, and also talking a lot about the gut microbiome, which is what I'll be talking a lot about today. So this workshop really, to me, is the perfect combination of a lot of the concepts that we try to deliver within a health and wellness plan for digestive health. Next slide, Grayson. So I want to just talk a little bit about fermented foods and just get some basic principles down in terms of the science so that we can proceed with really understanding and appreciating just how important these foods are to our health. So fermentation really is a process whereby microbes are combined with a substrate like milk or grains or grapes, for example, and it produces a new food that's really more stable, it's less toxic, and it's more nutritious. So the new food also has unique taste, it has a unique texture, and so it really adds the diversity of the different foods that we can enjoy. Fermentation really is an anaerobic process. It can be classified based on microorganisms that are used in their manufacture, but it's also described as the type of food that we're using to start the material. In general, I'd say the most important microbes in fermentation are our lactic acid producing microbes, such as Aspergillus, Lactobacillus, and Streptococcus. And these are really used to create foods such as dairy, our cheese, and our yogurt, certain vegetables like sauerkraut and kimchi, our cereals like sourdough bread, and meats like salami. There are other bacteria that also produce important foods such as Saccharomyces, and Clostridium and acetic acid. And so you can see that there's a wide variety of foods that ultimately require fermentation in order to be produced. There's another main group of fermentation microorganisms, which are fungi, like the yeast, for example, that are used for baking, brewing, and wine making. So important things in this area, certainly. We want to emphasize that not all fermented foods contain live cultures. So many food products do undergo more processing after fermentation. They could be pasteurized, for example, or smoked or baked or filtered. And all of these processes actually will kill or remove the live microorganisms. And so examples of those types of foods that don't contain live microbes include things like soy sauces, some beers and wines, bread, some chocolate as well. Next slide, Grayson. So it's really important to emphasize that fermented foods is really this marriage between an ancient art and modern medicine. So of course, humans have known how to make these foods for thousands of years. So it's akin to an ancient food preservation technique that basically enhances the nutritional value and boosts the shelf life of certain foods. But in modern medicine, the emphasis really has come from the fact that fermented foods contain live microbes. And these are important for introducing microbes into the gut and introducing increased biodiversity of the gut microbiome. Next slide, Grayson. So one of the most important findings in science over the last decade is that our gut is actually full of healthy microbes. And so this is called the gut microbiome. So what is the microbiome? Let's dissect that apart a little bit more. So the microbiome is all the organisms that live in and in our body. And this includes bacteria that are really well studied, but it also includes things like fungus, viruses, parasites, worms, bacteriophages, and even archaea, which are the most primitive organisms on Earth. It's actually really incredible to realize that we're actually part human, part bacteria, and that within our bodies, we have colonies of microbes that live not only in our gut, but for example, in our lungs, in our mouth, underneath our eyelids, and even in our GYN parts. So the Human Microbiome Project is the largest study of the gut microbiome that started about a decade ago. And they estimate that there's about 50 to 100 trillion organisms that inhabit our gut alone. So the lower gut, called the colon, is the largest microbiome in the body. So to really put these numbers into perspective, because it is quite daunting that we as doctors didn't even know the gut microbiome existed, and now it's become the focus of much of the science about our health and wellness. Really, when you think about it, when we look at the cells in the human body, there's 10 times more microbes in the gut than there are cells in the human body. And there's actually about 100 times more genes or genetic material that comes from our gut biome than is part of the entire human genome. So while our genetic code actually between all of us in this presentation today is about 99.9% the same, our microbiome is actually only about 30 to 70% the same. So I think a lot of scientists these days are arguing that perhaps the diversity between all of us actually may stem from our microbiome and not necessarily from our genetic polymorphisms. I oftentimes like to say the microbiome is actually a more specific identifier of you than your own DNA. And the microbiome's impact is far reaching, and it really is linked to so many different diseases and aspects of our human physiology. We know that it's linked to many digestive disorders that I study, but also obesity and mood disorders and autoimmune disease. So we're learning more and more about the importance of these microbes in our gut. Next slide, Grayson. So what is the function of the gut microbiome? I oftentimes consider our microbes to be our worker bees. So first and foremost, I like to emphasize that microbes are actually beneficial to our health, and they're actually involved in almost every aspect of human physiology. I think, the traditional germ theory that all of us sort of have the mindset about is that, microbes are evil. We like to use antibiotics to eradicate germs and microbes. But what we've come to learn is that our gut is full of microbes called commensals. They not only hang out in the gut, but they actually provide tremendous benefit and protection to us. So we know there's many functions, and this image is just kind of giving you a good summary of a lot of the different aspects of our health that the gut microbiome is involved in. We know first and foremost that our good gut bacteria actually are protective against overgrowth of potential pathogens, and therefore they protect us against infection. So when you've got lots of good gangs, they don't allow the bad gangs to overcome, and so they prevent illness from that standpoint. We've also learned that our microbes are actually extremely important in digestion. We know that they actually help to synthesize some vitamins and break down carbohydrates, things that we actually wouldn't be able to do on our own without our microbes. So in a lot of ways, our microbes have evolved with us so that we've developed a relationship where we actually need them for a lot of our digestive function. We also know that they're involved in so many other important processes that extend beyond the gut, including metabolism, maintaining our body weight, promoting our health and immune system, and regulating our brain function and mood. So every day we're learning more and more about the microbiome and just how far-reaching its impact is on the human body. Next slide, Grayson. So there's a lot of new information that we've uncovered and a lot of new terminology that's come into play as a result of this. So dysbiosis, I'm going to say it's a new term in medicine, and it's not one that we throw around a lot in our regular clinical practices. It's really defined as an imbalance in the gut microbiome. So when there's a change in the balance within the gut ecosystem, this really translates into the potential for diseases like autoimmune diseases or metabolic diseases like obesity. It's a very simple concept, and obviously the science is more complicated, and obviously the human body is very, very complicated. But the key point is that when our microbiome shifts and favors organisms that might be potential pathogens, we may be setting ourselves up for different types of diseases. And so dysbiosis may be a first step in illness. Next slide, Jason. And over the past decade or so, there have been over 10,000 articles that have been published that have linked the gut microbiome to diseases that we would think have absolutely nothing to do with the gut. So there's currently robust literature that links the gut microbiome with things like diabetes, obesity, heart disease, fatty liver, inflammatory bowel disease, colon cancer, depression, asthma, and allergies. Just you can see just how far reaching the health of the gut microbiome is in terms of our overall health and security. Next slide. So in our modern lives, we know that we create moments of dysbiosis. So I oftentimes say dysbiosis is our new normal in the modern era through lifestyle practices that we've developed, including overutilization of antibiotics, the high stress that we bring into our lives, the standard American diet that's more focused on fats and protein and less focused on fiber, and then being hyper vigilant about hygiene so that we oftentimes don't incorporate practices that introduce more microbes into our body. We're actually over time altering our intestinal microbiome, and this downstream consequence is seeing more chronic inflammatory conditions like autoimmune diseases and also metabolic conditions like obesity, heart disease, and diabetes. Next slide, Grayson. So really the goal in terms of restoring a healthy gut microbiome is to do that by using food as medicine. So ultimately, fermented foods are the ultimate probiotic. So the World Health Organization defines a probiotic as a food or supplement that contains live microorganisms intended to maintain or improve the good gut bacteria in the body. And so the first examples that obviously emerge are fermented foods. And this is just a good example of the wide variety of fermented foods that are out there that help to introduce more probiotics or live microorganisms into the gut. And so the general principle that we've seen from multiple studies in all sorts of diseases is that the more biodiverse your microbiome is, the more likely you are to have health rather than disease, and the less likely you are to have things like diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and digestive dysfunction. Next slide, Grayson. So there's also another concept when we're cultivating a healthy microbiome and trying to use food as medicine, and that's prebiotics. So prebiotics are actually foods, typically high fiber foods that act as food for the human microbiome. So prebiotics are really feeding the gut microbiome. And it's our intention that if we feed our microbiome well, we're basically going to improve the balance of good microorganisms in the body. And these are just some examples of the prebiotic foods that are commonly used by our gut microbiome. When we look at the standard American diet or the modern diet, we know that our diet is very heavy in processed carbohydrates, in fats, and in protein. And when you think about it, all of those elements of our diet are actually absorbed quite high up into the gut. And keep in mind that our gut microbiome is all the way down in our lower gut called the colon. And really the only things that feed the gut microbiome are high fiber foods or prebiotics. And so ultimately, by removing a lot of the fiber in our diet, we have over time been starving out our good gut bacteria and having huge implications for how our microbiome is balanced. Next slide, Grayson.
Before we move on, we've got a question in the chat of how much prebiotics should we eat?
That's a great question. So I think a lot when we talk about fermented foods, and of course Pat's going to go into this in a lot greater detail, we sometimes think that we need a huge amount of fermented food in order to get the benefit of the pre and the probiotic. It's actually just a very small amount that you have to take in order to get the benefits of the pre and the probiotics. So the last concept is a fairly new one. So this is just in the last couple of years. There's a new concept in the microbiome world called postbiotics. And this is how important the science is, because it's being unraveled in real time right now. And we're learning so many new things. But when it comes down to it, fermented foods are actually the perfect food because they incorporate all of these. So postbiotics is actually a term used to describe all of the compounds that the gut microbiome develops to help promote our health and wellness. So we're obviously going to look at the microbiome from the context of good microbes, but then these good microbes in the downstream also produce various vitamins and nutrients. They produce various antimicrobial peptides. They produce something called short chain fatty acids, which are the ultimate anti-inflammatory fatty acid in the gut. They create various carbohydrate active enzymes and hydrogen peroxide that acidifies the gut. So there's a lot of things that are produced by the gut microbiome. So for the longest time, we've been obsessed in science about trying to catalog all the microbes in our gut. But now the research is really moving forward to, well, what are these microbes doing downstream? What enzyme pathways are they activating? What nutrients are they producing? And so that's really where fermented foods come into play. Because when you think about it, a fermented food brings all of these concepts together. You've got the live microbes, you've got the prebiotic that you can combine with the probiotic, and then ultimately you're deriving the postbiotic. So you're in that one healthy food able to bring all of those different components together. Next slide, Grayson. So we know that there's been a robust literature about health benefits of fermented foods, but we're going to be learning more and more about this in the coming years as science really has started to delve more deeply into the role of food in chronic inflammatory conditions. We know that there's many health benefits, including reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and inflammation. So certainly metabolic and inflammatory diseases improve when you add fermented foods to your diet. There's also been linkages to better weight management, better mood and brain activity, and better bone health, as well as recovery after exercise. So all of these benefits are ultimately linked to a more biodiverse and healthy gut microbiome. And certainly fermented foods are a part of that plan. When I meet patients in clinic, they oftentimes will ask me, well, is it better for me to take a probiotic? Or is it better for me to try to get my good gut microbes in other ways? And I really do like to emphasize that we get most of our healthy gut microbes from the foods that we eat. And certainly the fermented foods are not only giving us the probiotic, but they're also giving us the benefit of the postbiotics, that new concept of all the different vitamins and peptides and that high nutrient density that you're deriving from that food. So that extra benefit that we'll be seeing. So rather than just taking a probiotic, you're now taking a whole food that's providing the pre, post, and the probiotic. So I think that there's going to be a lot of great information that's going to be coming out in the future about the role of fermented foods in not only our gut health, but all sorts of different diseases and metabolic syndrome. We look forward to talking to you more, and I'm happy to answer any of the questions that might come up.
So the first of the questions we have, is there a test that can tell you more about the state of your gut biome, how much probiotic, prebiotic, and so on you have now?
So that's a really great question. So we really are in the Wild West in terms of the gut microbiome right now. So certainly there are certain companies, for example, that are offering things like microbiome sequencing. And certainly we say that there are a lot of direct consumer products that are out there in terms of helping you to understand your gut microbiome well and providing you with detailed analysis of what probiotics may be best for you. But many of those tests have not been validated by research and science, and so they're proprietary. So we don't have a lot of information about them. I think the largest human gut project is called the American Gut Project. It's based out of the University of California in San Diego. And that is, it's called a citizen science project where all of us can actually donate our stool for analysis. And we're actually also contributing to science as well. So I think that the science is certainly there. I think we're not there in terms of an opportunity for you to be seen in practice and have someone order a microbiome sequencing test for you and being able to analyze that in real time. I think right now, the more that we're learning from the American Gut Project, the more we're realizing that a lot of the lifestyle changes that we have to make in terms of making sure that we're on a low processed diet, a whole food diet, and one that really focuses on enhancing our fiber so that we're feeding our gut microbes has been shown to be beneficial. But I think in 2020, we're not there in terms of being able to provide you with detailed microbiome sequencing that can then translate into tailored probiotics. I think right now we're still at the baseline level of really enhancing lifestyle changes to bring health benefit in terms of the gut microbiome. It's a great question, though.
Another question, how often do our gut microbes change?
That's a really great question. They actually change very quickly. So one of the hardest things about studying the gut microbiome is just how quickly the microbiome changes. So you can imagine having to analyze trillions of pieces of data in any one subset in science. And now you've spawned a whole data analytics field that's devoted to trying to understand how to analyze trillions of pieces of information. But the neat thing about the microbiome is that it actually changes fairly quickly. So even within a week of changing your diet, say you go from primarily a high fat or a keto diet to going towards a Mediterranean diet, we oftentimes will see changes in the microbiome fairly quickly. So it is, there's a lot of hope, among a lot of us that perhaps, our genes aren't necessarily our destiny, that perhaps our microbiome and how we're able to mold that and shape it may, have much higher influence than just our DNA. And we're also actually learning that our microbes actually are involved in something called an epigenetic phenomenon, where they're actually very intricately involved in turning our genes on and off. And so oftentimes, the right lifestyle changes and rebalancing the gut microbiome becomes an important priority in terms of helping to actually sort of reverse, our genes that might not be beneficial to us necessarily.
Follow-up question. We talked a little bit about sanitation as part of the reasons for gut dysbiosis. In our current environment of hand washing and sanitizing everything, we're probably washing away the good bacteria as well, right?
So that's a great point. So of course we're in a pandemic and everything about our lives has changed dramatically. So we have to look at hygiene in a different way right now. But certainly, when we look at our lives in general, we do have to come to that realization that our super sanitized lifestyles do contribute to altering the gut microbiome. I think we see it more and more in children. When you look at the concept of why children have so many food allergies, for example, and other generations before them really didn't have those same types of allergies. We actually think that it may very well be linked to alterations in the gut microbiome. When we look at our children who may, be exposed to more antibiotics, may live a super sanitized life, may not play in dirt like we did, and may be more exposed to hand sanitizer, perhaps early in their lives when the gut microbiome is being molded and when the immune system is being trained by the microbiome, those pinnacle years between being born and the age of 3, when your gut microbiome is the most active in terms of the training of the immune system, perhaps those are the answers in terms of why we see, chronic diseases in children now, obesity, more autoimmune diseases. So we do think that that certainly our lifestyle plays a big role in it. Of course, in a pandemic, everything changes, and we have to be more vigilant about our hygiene in general. But certainly, I think the rule of thumb in terms of looking at our overall health and wellness beyond COVID, after we get out of this pandemic, should be that we should all live a little dirty, eat clean, live dirty, and really help to shape a healthy, biodiverse microbiome. That's a great question.
Thank you. So it's also a great transition point, and now I'm going to stop our screen share so that we see each other's faces once more. My name is Grayson Sheeler. I am Outreach Director for Allegheny Mountain Institute. We are hosting this class today, and we are very passionate about playing in dirt. We are a part of the programming here at Augusta Health Hospital and in the Stanton, Augusta, Waynesboro, Virginia region, because we are so passionate about playing in dirt, about training farmers and food advocates, and about food as medicine and its potential to really transform health. So we operate a farm that is about an acre, growing vegetables on the hospital campus. And in just a moment, I'll pass the floor over to Pat Banks, who manages that farm and leads that effort. This is one of our community education classes in a series that is dedicated to really helping people to solidify that connection between what you eat, what you stand for in your community, and what your health is like, and the health of our entire region. So I think Dr. Srivastava is going to stay on the line with us if you have any further medical questions. But we also wanted to have Pat's perspective and input here, as he's going to talk a little bit more about the practical aspects of how to make and enjoy some fermented foods.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Grayson. Welcome, everybody. Thanks, Savita, for that. It's good to hear your voice again. I feel like I haven't seen you in a while. Yeah, so I guess a little introduction to myself. As Grayson said, I'm Pat Banks. I manage the farm here at AMI's farm at Augusta Health. I'm also the farming director for Allegheny Mountain Institute. And on top of that, I'm a farming foodie. So I love fermented vegetables. I came to AMI in 2017, and I think the biggest takeaway I had was fermenting vegetables and other things on top of that, because there are many things to ferment out there. So I like to start off. I haven't taught this class or this section over Zoom yet, but yeah. If I haven't taught this class over Zoom yet, so bear with me. I don't have many slides prepared. It's going to be more of going to try doing semi hands-on. But I want to start first with kind of why I ferment. Being a farmer and avid homesteader and a passionate one, I believe, I just love finding ways to take back what I believe was stolen in our food system. And fermentation is just another way for that. And when we talk about fermentation, you can't not, and if Savita referenced it a few times, you can't not talk about culture. So when you talk about culture, you think yogurt cultures and sourdough cultures and all these cultures involved in fermentation. Well, not referencing culture, we're referencing nowadays. She also referenced ancient culture. Fermentation's been around, and for as long as mankind has been around, fermentation has been around as well, and still exists in every culture today. So it's a very unifying, along with food, fermentation is a unifying, thing throughout. So why do we ferment? Savita brought the health benefits. Fermentation is an act of preservation. You can ferment sauerkraut or any vegetable, and it'll keep for you for upwards of a year in the right conditions. And it's also just delicious. I think it really brings out flavor profiles of vegetables that you would otherwise think might not be as tasteful, but after fermenting, it really brings out their profile. There's many types of ferments, as Savita referenced to. I bet that anybody on this call had had thought about a fermented food today. If you drank coffee this morning, if you ate chocolate, which we often do here, all those things are ferments. Are ferments. So before we get into the practical, I just want to kind of set the stage and set the table of kind of go back over the good bacteria they're trying to promote, and a little bit about the bad bacteria. Before that, I want to read an excerpt from it's a reference book from Noma's Guide to Fermentation. It's a great book, and we can talk more about it at the end. But just to set the table, there's a thin line between rot and fermentation, and that line might be best understood as an actual line, like the kind you'd find outside a bar. Rot is a club where everyone gets in: bacteria, fungi, safe or unsafe, flavor enhancing or destructive. When you ferment something, you're taking on the role of a bouncer, keeping out wanted microbes and letting in the ones that are going to make the party pop. So with that, we're going to start with our good bacteria. Commonly in fermentation, where you hear the word lactic acid bacteria or lactofermentation. It's a common misconception that lactofermentation involves, milk or whey or, lactose. However, it's not. It's involving lactic acid bacteria, and that's one of the main components that Savita referenced early on. They're most abundant in fruits and vegetables. They give you that acidic taste you get in like sauerkraut or pickles. They thrive in a halo-tolerant environment, which is meaning salt. So a salt-heavy environment, which is a key component when you're fermenting vegetables. And they also thrive in an anaerobic environment or without oxygen. Another good bacteria that we often work with is acetic acid bacteria. This is where you get your alcohol, where it converts alcohol into acid. If you ever had a bottle of wine go bad and starts taking off or start taking more vinegary, that's the acetic acid bacteria infiltrating your wine, converting that alcohol into vinegar. So if you ever do have that happen, just leave that bottle of wine out. It'll turn into, that's where red wine vinegar comes from. And there's also, just touching on some beneficial fungi, there's also fungi involved in fermentation. One of the more common ones is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. This is where it's commonly involved in making beer or bread. And then just to touch on some of the, I'm gonna butcher these names, but some of the bad bacteria, it's Clostridium botulinum, which is the bacteria that is involved in botulism. It's more commonly involved with canning rather than fermenting, and it thrives in a warm environment. And it's recommended that by 2% like weight, salt weight, that really inhibits this bacteria. So as long as you stick to your salt weight, you have no problem. So how to recruit these beneficial bacteria? Most bacteria are around us, whether in the air. So it's really just leaving it open to the environment. There's also ways of backslopping, which we'll get into in a bit. But if you wash your veggies, wash your hands, and wash your containers, fermentation is as safe as possible. So before I begin and what's that?
Can I add something?
Yes, ma'am.
So one of the points that's come out in the chat that I also really agree with and wanted to acknowledge already is your vegetables' nutritional content is influenced by the health of your soil. So healthier soil means you've got more of the good guys. You've also got more of the vitamins and nutrients in your vegetable. So your end product is going to be more beneficial to you. But I also want to hook off of a point that Savita made earlier about the speed with which your gut microbiome changes. And that means that although it's wonderful on the sense that you can start today, make a beneficial change to your life and start to see that benefit really quickly, it's a bit of a challenge for those of us that are eating more seasonally or eating from farms to keep up your vegetable consumption that your gut needs to feed with that fiber through the darkest, coldest part of the winter. And that's where having fermented foods that preserve your harvest can be so important. So just as some tips from us on how to really make this process work for you, it's start with really, really good produce as your starting point. And when you have access to great fresh produce, make it last all year. If you've got that as your starting point, there are so many different directions that you can go from there. Back to you.
Cool. So before I begin and try to show you one of my favorite ferments, I have a few rules that I like to go by that I made up. One is start small. So when you're starting your ferment, you can go with a giant 5-gallon bin of sauerkraut or pickles. Well, if you're not quite comfortable with where you're going with or what your recipe is, you don't want to be stuck with 5 gallons of anything if it's bad. So I always recommend going with either half-gallon mason jar or a quart mason jar, and just kind of getting your recipe down, and then work your way up to that bigger product if you want a lot of it. Mistakes are going to be made when you ferment. It's okay. Ferments, I've had a lot of ferments go awry and a lot of bad ferments happen. And, sometimes I feel guilty about like wasting food. But those good microbes are going into your soil if you compost. So don't be afraid to compost or throw it out. It's fine. And then have fun and make a mess is one of my biggest rules. I love to just tear apart my kitchen and like just have this huge fermentation party and then clean it all up afterwards. It really is just satisfying for me. And then figure out what works for you, and don't be embarrassed by it, and don't there's no rules. People lay out rules where you get to ferment for 10 to 14 days, or they're some rules to stand by, but if something tastes right to you and it tastes good, after 2 or 3 days of fermentation, eat it. It's gonna be great. Cool. So what we're gonna be talking about today is there's many different ways to ferment, but the most basic one is like making your own salt brine with vegetables. And there's really no end in what kind of vegetables you can use. Anything from, there's certain vegetables like potatoes and onions that aren't, they don't carry that bacteria that lactic acid bacteria is going to help ferment on the skins. So you may have to like inoculate them. But other than that, most vegetables have the capacity to be fermented in multiple different ways. One of a great book to purchase and a good reference guide for me is it's called Fermented Vegetables by Kristen Shockley. It goes vegetable by vegetable in the book, and it has great recipes throughout, and I use it a lot. It's really been an amazing book. So that's a good find if you're looking for some help, like coming up with recipes and what to use and what not to use, especially when you have an abundance of something. So what you're going to need to ferment is you're going to need a cutting board, which I'm not going to pick up, a knife, and then a vessel to ferment it or put your vegetables in. So today I'm just going to use this quart mason jar for reference, but you can use really anything that you can, like anything that's glass or ceramic. You never want to use metal, because that when those acetic acids, when those bacteria get in there, it's gonna be an acidic environment. It's gonna create rust. So don't use metal or tin or something that's gonna rust. That's gonna definitely go awry. I often use old gallon. I actually brought one. Old gallon pickle jars from. I have a lot of friends who work in the restaurant industry, so they're very willing to just give me whatever they have. There's also crocks, which I didn't bring one today, but fermentation crocks are definitely really it's a ceramic, and they come in like 1 to 5 gallons of ceramic clay pot, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. So your vessel, you get your cutting board, you get your knife, and then you have your vegetables. Like as Grayson mentioned, it's all about input. So I believe that the input you put in, like a locally grown produce, the best vegetable you put in, the best salt you put in, the best ferment you're going to get. So today I have Kohlrabi from our farm here at AMI's Farm and Augusta Health. This is the Kohlrabi. If you're not familiar with it, I looked it up actually before we started. It's German for cabbage turnip. So what you do is you peel this Kohlrabi, and then you get this, or half of it. And then what I like to do is dice it up into little cubes like that, and ferment them with dill and onions. And the way I like to do my onions is little kind of like the size of the Kohlrabi, like a dice size, just to get that onion flavor. I like to put onions in just about everything. So so we have our vegetables, we have our salt. Going back to input, salt is the most important part about fermentation. It creates that environment for to have the lactic acid bacteria thrive while keeping out all the bad bacteria. If you're looking for a scientific, you can do vegetables by weight. Many people recommend 5% by weight of the vegetables to salt content. I do a little more, and that ends up being, for a quart mason jar like this, I do a tablespoon, and that's a little over typically 5% weight volume. So that's just a hint on salt. With kosher, the type of salt matters. Iodized salt can work, but it's not good. It's not known to be good at preventing those bad bacteria. So using sea salt and using sea salt or kosher salt or Celtic salt, I like to use it's a giant tub of salt, but this is called real salt. It's from here in the U.S. It's out of Utah, so I try to keep it semi local. But yeah, salt is important. Cool. So we have our vegetables. Himalayan salt works as well. Yep. we have our vegetables. I went through the process of dicing it all up into this bowl. So after you've diced everything up, you can really ferment. The flavor profile's up to you. Like I said, I like to use this kohlrabi as like a dill pickle kind of substitute. So I just fill it up. There's some garlic in there too, and I do that. Like the onions, just chopped up in like little bigger pieces, just to get the flavor in there. Second.
Does it matter how tightly you're packing your jar?
You want to get as much as possible in there. With the way we're doing it right now, you're not going to get as much as like you would if you were doing different ferments. Like if you're a famous one's, making sauerkraut, which unfortunately I don't have time to do today. But when you do like a finely shredded ferment, you really want to jam the ferments in there, and you want to do that with these too. So cool. So I got those in there. I left a little room at the top. As you can see, you want a little room for your water, because we're gonna add water to this. This is what makes this unique. We're making our own salt brine. So we're gonna add water to the ferment. Let me get a tablespoon here. So just taking a tablespoon of salt. And you can, and some people, they mix it up before. Sorry, so I hold the jar up, get in the chat a bit.
Yeah, just hold your jar up so we can see it better as you add that in.
Sure. Some people will mix their salt and like boil their water before adding this in. And that's to do, if you're using city water, I would recommend doing that to purify the water. If you don't have a water purification, or if you're not on a well, I would boil the water with the salt together. You just gotta be careful though. You definitely have to let that water cool down, or else you're gonna kill a lot of the bacteria that are on your vegetables, like on the kohlrabi or on the dill. So if you do boil it, let it cool to at least room temperature before adding. But I like to do it. I just have some filtered water here. I just like to add the tablespoon of salt right in. I'm not gonna be able to hold it up here, guys. All right, so it's about, it's about I would say, mostly full. I'm leaving a little bit of space at the top just because I don't want to overflow it and spill it all over my computer here. But after you put the water in, you definitely want to shake it up and make sure that salt dissolves in there. And after that, that's it in terms of like what we need to do for putting inputs in. Now the biggest task tackle here is weighting it down to create that anaerobic environment where the vegetables are below the water brine. So there's a few ways to do this. With these salt brines, it's a little tricky because these are all floating in there. So I like to use, personally, you can try to put like clay or glass, like if you have anything that's clay or glass that can hold in there to hold it down. You can also use, I don't quite recommend this, but I do use it for some ferments. This is a bag of water, and it can work just by putting it in and sitting on top like that. It holds that, the water is, like, I don't know if you can see or not, but the water is above the vegetables, and that'll work just fine too. I just caution with using plastic inside of ferments. I can't speak to if it is true or not, but I feel like the fermentation process might leach some of that plastic in there. But I have done it with certain things that are difficult to really hold down. One of the other tricks I use, once I'm getting ahead of myself. So you have your weights, you ever ferment. Now you're gonna wait, 3, 4, 5 days. And every day throughout that, you're gonna wanna burp it or just crack the lid. So you got your weight on. You leave it on the counter, and every morning and every night I like to just go through and just simply just pop the top, and eventually you will start hearing like the fizz. It's getting almost like it's getting carbonated. It's because it is. That's where your fermentation process is taking place. So when that happens, you want to definitely check on your ferment and make sure it's all the vegetables are staying below the weight. However, I've learned in the past year or so that you can, if you want to be really intimate with your ferments, which I like to do, you can simply you don't have to put any weight in this style ferment. You can just every morning or at least once a day, go through, tip it upside down, bring it back up and burp it. And that I've learned that does not, there's no bad bacteria or no bad growth happens when I do that. But again, that's if you're going to be really intimate with it. If you're going to leave it for 2 or 3 days, I would not recommend doing that. But if you are going to, kind of pay closer attention to it, that's an okay process too. You can also leave the lid off. If you put a weight in there, you can put a little cloth over it with a rubber band to just keep like fruit flies and stuff out, and then you won't have to burp it, and it'll burp itself.
Well, it turned sour. It's our last question, or most recent question.
Yeah, inherently, it becomes more sour when you ferment. I guess acidity and sour go hand in hand. So that's kind of the profile that I'm going for when, I think anybody's going for when they're fermenting. It depends on the sourness you want. So again, tasting it, I taste my ferments all along the way. So once it starts fermenting, you'll really know it. You'll see. I wish I would have brought one of mine in from home, but you'll see these bubbles. It'll start bubbling up. It'll be very, very active. And one of the many things I love to do is burp it and just listen, because it's so much activity going on in there. It's just fun to know, and it's just fun to see. So after that, after you ferment it, you're checking on it every day. Taste it, and you start developing a taste of like, oh, it's a little, it tastes pretty good, and you'll see the taste. I want a little more sourness, I want a little more. Once you're like, this is really good, or I really like this, it's okay to take it out, take it off the counter and put it in the fridge. A ferment like this can last, like I alluded to. I still have Kohlrabi from last year that I fermented like this in my fridge. That's still good. So it can last in the fridge in that environment in a year, or in a root cellar, anything like that. Reading the comments here. If after a week it's still salty, then is it garbage? I wouldn't say it's garbage. I would let it keep going. Let it. I'd give it another week or so, and if it still becomes saltier, if it's still very salty, that salt's going to go away with the more it ferments.
So one thing that you can kind of gain from Pat mentioning that if you want to stop the process, you can put it in the fridge or a root cellar, cold places, is that the fermentation process can speed up or slow down based on ambient temperature as one of the factors. So if after a week you're still tasting a lot of salt, it may be that your environment is just more prone to slow ferments, and it may take a little bit more time than is standard. And that's okay. It doesn't mean something's going wrong. It's just not going as quickly.
One thing, going back to the weights, one thing I like to use too is the excess vegetable leaves off of the vegetables. This is kohlrabi leaves, and I'll use cabbage leaves or stuff like that to help weight down vegetables as well. So some problems that can occur, it becomes when things become, there's comm yeast and there's yeast and there's mold. Mold is bad. Mold's gonna be bad for you. So that's and mold typically happens when either there's mold in the vegetable, like if you're putting a rotten vegetable into your ferment. That's another thing, is make sure they're clean. So no rotten vegetables. And then, but the most common thing I've run into is what's called comm yeast. And what it is, it's more of a creamy color, and it's not bad. It's just it looks like it could be bad. And so it's hard to describe over the internet here. But if you're interested, do a quick Google search. It just looks like a creamy, kind of like bubbly substance where mold is going to be more of like a fuzzy, a fuzzy substance that's going to, it would definitely going to come from like neglect or rotten produce. And typically white mold is okay, black mold is bad. You can scrape off mold on your ferments. I've never done this myself, but I've heard of people who've had like 5-gallon sauerkrauts going for a year, and they just leave them in their basements or in the root cellars, and they'll go through and they'll have like a mold line, like of white mold that thick, and they'll just go through, scrape it off, and eat what's on the bottom of it. Again, do your research before doing something like that, but yeah, that's kind of the troubleshooting problems that I run into personally. If the top is funny, then it is garbage.
You really just talked about that, if the top's fuzzy.
Yeah, I'm trying to. There we go. Okay. Cool. That's kind of the runaround of the pickles. I was going to touch on a few other things, but I just want to give it time for some questions around the actual process of it before we move on here. Some of the things I like to pickle are carrots and turnips and radishes. This is honestly my favorite recipe. This dill kohlrabi. It's a cucumber. The reason why is cucumbers are very hard to get right. For myself, I've struggled with, like, they just go mushy really fast. So I like kohlrabi because it maintains its crunchy texture throughout the fermentation process. So. Sorry, I'm seeing the chat a bit here. Yeah, so it's very important to use boiled or filtered water. Yeah, chlorine, whatever else is in, like, treated water is definitely going to affect your ferment. So again, recommending, if you do boil your water, be careful though to let it cool down before adding it to your brine, to adding it to your vegetables, to not kill off any of the good bacteria on your vegetables. Beets, yeah, I use beets quite a bit. If you're going to do something like this with beets, I would use I would cook your beets first, which kind of is counterintuitive to what I say, because you are going to kill off all the good bacteria on those beets when you cook them, but they're not going to ferment. Eating a raw beet is still going to be like eating a raw beet after you ferment it, unless you include it on a kraut, which unfortunately, if you shred it up and include it into like a kraut like that. But if you're trying to do like a cooked beet, or like a beet like this size, I would cook them first and then kind of backslop. And I don't think I touched on backslopping yet, but when you backslop, it's after this is done fermenting, this liquid in here is going to be really good. Do not throw it away. It's really good to take a gut shot every, in the morning or before dinner, to get those probiotics really, accelerate in your stomach for digestion. And then also you can use this brine to, like, inoculate your next ferment. So stuff like onions and potatoes and, cooked beets, this stuff is going to inoculate and help jumpstart, and will jumpstart those ferments. Cool.
Any other questions right now?
Sounds good. So just to touch on some other types of ferments, there's liquid ferments. So when you think liquid, kombucha is a very common one. Vinegar is a ferment that I've really enjoyed. Making throughout the past. Just not something I really thought about when I got first started in the ferment world, but kombucha or vinegar is active fermentation too. It's just a different style of converting alcohol into acid. Again, going back to the wine reference, once you create that wine from, the wine goes from grape juice. So it goes from grape juice, your Saccharomyces gets into the grape juice, converts the sugars into alcohol, and then your acetic acid bacteria get into the alcohol and convert that wine into vinegar. That's a process for just about every vinegar you can think of. So white wine vinegar, malt vinegar, that's the beer process of making that. So a lot of vinegars can get pointed back to that. And there's a lot of drinking vinegars out there that's really good for you. It's kind of like a low acidic vinegar. It's called Shrub. So if you're interested in that, that's something I really enjoyed making in the past. Cheese is a big one. Bread. That's with a sourdough starter that I'm sure people have heard about. And this is a great reference book. It's tartine bread. It's just one of the top notch. It's very easy to follow, easy guide. If you're looking to get more into the bread world. Not my expertise, but I have done it. And then another point of reference is it's just a good book for brewing beer, something I've dabbled in too. That's also an active fermentation. This is called the Sacred and Herbal Healing Beers. Just very simple, very easy guidelines to follow in this book. And then the last point of reference I'm going to go with is, if you ever heard of them, Sandor Katz. It's called The Art of Fermentation. It's more of an encyclopedia about the benefits of fermentation, the different types of fermentation. It'll go through everything I just word dumped there. And it's not a reference. It's not a how-to book. It's more of a explaining all the different types of ferments that are out there. There are a lot of how-to books, like the one again, this one. Kristen Shockley is a good how-to book. Sandor Katz also has a lot of how-to books out there. He's kind of the fermentation renaissance guy. So, and there's also, meat. There's the whole world of ferment that I haven't even dabbled into yet, of fermenting meat and doing stuff, doing crazy stuff like that. So, it's a giant field to explore, and it's a fun one. So, anybody else have any further questions? I think that does it for me.
So in addition to fermenting with salt, which you showed us today, is there more information you can give us about kombucha or whey?
Sure. So kombucha, the common theory about kombucha is you need a SCOBY. So it's a symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast. That's what it stands for. The only way I know how to drive is a giant booger. And then you put that in your, it would be a sugary drink. Then add your SCOBY in, and it inoculates your kombucha, your drink, and it turns it into kombucha. And that's kind of how, I don't know, does that answer the question? I
think so.
That's how to kind of upstart. It's another form of backslapping with vinegar or raw drink to create kombucha. And kombucha can go vinegary too if you've ever had experience with that. And that's fine. If it does go vinegary, use it. I use it as vinegar. With whey, I'm not too familiar with. You can inoculate everything we've talked about. You can inoculate this with whey. I've not dove into that yet, but I know a lot of people do. And it's recommended in a lot of recipes that people, use some form of inoculation as whey or your old kind of ferments.
And also a question: when you have your jar fermenting on your counter, you've mixed up your pickled vegetables and you're waiting. Do you have to consider whether they should be in direct sun or in a darker space? More about temperature. Tell us a little more.
Yeah, I would recommend any ferment in a darker space. The direct sunlight's going to either heat up your ferment. You want to control what kind of temperature you have. The hotter it gets, it is going to ferment faster. So if it is for me, if I'm fermenting at my home during the middle of summer and it's 90 degrees out and 75 in my house, that ferment's going to be very, very active, very quick. So things are going to go fast. But right now, controlling it at 65 during this cool time, it's going to be a little slower ferment. So my rule of thumb with something like this, I start tasting this at 5 days, and it's usually around a week to 10 days that I'm done. I'm done using this. But again, taste it every step of the way.
So is it important to keep that temperature consistent, or just to plan for it?
If you're trying for consistency, that's something I'm now kind of delving into, is how to consistently produce the same product, because I'm interested in possibly doing something on my own. And So if you're looking for consistency, then yes, it's not that important in terms of it's still going to ferment. It's just at what rate. Like if this ferments in the middle of summer, maybe 3 or 4 days. Right now, 5 to 7. And I haven't gotten too deep into the scientific world of the flavor profile of the ferments, the different of summer versus winter. But that'd be an interesting experiment.
How about when you started with a reused jar? How do you sterilize your jars?
I just, I run it through a dishwasher, or honestly, some hot water and soap does it too. I've never had any issues with. Knock on wood, I haven't a whole lot of issues going with ferments going awry, like with bad mold or stuff like that. And I've been fermenting now a lot for 5 years. And most of my fermentation problems come from I just got way too experimental and it does not taste great.
Experimenting is kind of the joy of it too, though.
It is, yes, and that's part of it. Have fun. I like to mix up everything. I know, and you can ferment, and it's not just vegetables. You can ferment fruits too, and that's a really interesting idea. Going back to that first book I was talking about, I would say this is a little more advanced, but they do a lot of cool stuff at this restaurant, and they ferment everything. Fruits. They have a fermentation like part of the restaurant that they ferment fruits and all different sorts of stuff. And I was going with fruits. Is that one of my epic failures of the years? I tried fermenting some wild cherries, and it was just terrible. So. My compost loved it though.
If folks have any other questions, now is the time to type them into our chat box. So we have a question about water bath canning your ferments.
So you can do it. You can definitely can your ferments. However, it's kind of defeating the purpose of eating the ferment. So when you growing up my entire life, my family made sauerkraut, and they did all the fermentation steps and fermented the sauerkraut. Once it tasted good, they water bath canned it. But what you're doing when you water bath can, you sterilize it, you're gonna kill off all the good bacteria that all the probiotics that you've gone to create. Those are all gonna would be killed off during that water bath process.
So as I understand it, the benefit would be from a purely flavor standpoint. If you get it where you like it, you freeze that moment in time, and you know that it's going to consistently have that flavor. But the downside is you're going to miss the opportunity to get all of those great benefits that Dr. Srivastava talked about for your gut.
Yep. And, it's not, still, I would say, like, we'll use sauerkraut as an example. I would say that sauerkraut's still good for you. It's just not, you're just not getting the probiotic benefit as you would if you just had a live ferment. So. And going back to what Dr. Srivastava said, it does not take, I eat it depends, but usually half a cup of sauerkraut a day. I'm not big into sauerkraut, but a half a cup of sauerkraut a day, which is a good amount, but it's probably over, it doesn't need to be a lot. I like to do it before eat before meals. I like to eat before meals and just to get my gut going.
So if you've got your jar fermenting,
yep,
and your brine is bubbling out and it starts to get a little dry, can you add salt water?
You can. So just to explain a little bit about sauerkraut versus what we're doing here. So we're creating this salt brine with water. When you're doing something like sauerkraut and you're you're attempting to create its own brine. So you're drawing the water out of the vegetable, creating its own brine. And to reference that, you can do that. I would caution though, it just might take away some flavor profile. I've never done that myself. I have had it bubble over though when it you pack your lid or you pack your crock or you pack your jar. If you ever do sauerkraut, make sure you leave like a good like inch or two of headspace for that brine to really sit on top, because and definitely put something underneath it for the brine to catch, or else it's going to go all over the place. So I would wonder though if that brine wasn't, like with a sauerkraut, when I think sauerkraut's done is when that after 10 to 14 days that the brine kind of sucks up back into the cabbage. But if it's like completely dry, I would try it. I would try it out. I don't have any experience with it, but I would give it an attempt. And I might just do like, make a salt brine of like a quart of water with a tablespoon of salt and just add what you need. Or like a 5, kind of ratio your salt and then add it to the.
Any further questions?
Me too.
Do you ever use vinegar for fermenting?
Absolutely, yeah. I use vinegar for just about everything, but fermenting for sure. What I like to do a lot too is, like we call it the quick pickle or the quickle. You like shredding up like radishes or turnips and adding like your raw apple cider vinegar in there. And it'll quick pickle your either, it could be pickles or, whatever you decide. But yes, vinegar is definitely used in fermentation a lot. And I've used it. I haven't used it so much with like I haven't experimented with like what we're talking about here with like lactic acid bacteria ferment, but like in terms of I've never added to like a salt brine or a kraut brine. I've always just added like straight vinegar to vegetables and put it in the fridge. I know when you can, vinegar is used primarily in canning. So do that high acid environment.
Okay, this is our final call for questions. Speak now or forever hold your peace. I always say that, but you can always send us an email if you come up with questions after our class together.
There's a lot of like groups out there to, be a part. Like if you're on social media, there's amples of groups to like run questions by and see what other people are doing. Yeah, so again, don't be afraid to experiment, and it's a fun world to get into, and ferment on, feed your gut.
So we had a question about the farm. Our farm is ordinarily open to visitors, although it is not open for woofing or homestays. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are more regulated now, particularly with being on a hospital campus. But AMI does operate a farm and food system fellowship program where we are constantly training young people to be farmers, to be food science nerds like Pat and I, as well as food literacy educators, and filling many other new roles in the food system. So in a typical year, those fellows are learning as well as working in the communities a little bit more visibly than they are right now. And there are more opportunities to come and see our work, volunteer. At the moment, you just have to be on Zoom with us. Pat and I are both alumni of that Farm and Food System Fellowship program.
And hopefully next year we typically teach this with more hands-on, where we're all making this kind of stuff, so it's a little more hands-on. So hopefully we can get to that point sometime here in 2021. I guess the wood tamper. I've never used a wooden tamper for sauerkraut, but I've used a lot of wooden like stirring sticks for vinegar and stuff like that. Yeah, it's a great thing to use, and don't maybe rinse it off, but don't really really go at it with your by sterilizing it, because all the good bacteria that you touch with that wooden tamper it's kind of using the same as what you do with back slopping with like a ferment. That's gonna there's a lot of research done with and a lot of people out there who swear by having those wooden utensils that hold those bacteria.
From a food safety perspective, though, that also means be a little bit careful with your wooden utensils. It's great to have one that's just for veggies and not touching raw meat, for example. Cutting boards, too. It's great to keep one for veggies and one for a little bit more high-risk foods. Yeah, it's great to also punch down your veggies with your hands. There is a lot of really fascinating research coming out about what stays on our hands, particularly if you are engaged in healthy behaviors like digging in the dirt of your garden or making sourdough. A lot of the taste variation in sourdough bread they are finding can be traced back to the baker's hands, which is just really amazing to think about. So if you are using your hands to really pack down something like a sauerkraut, as long as your hands have been cleaned fairly recently, and you're packing it down tight, it'll be great. Yeah, and the Ferment to Table workshop, that's a little bit more of what this feels like in a typical year, but we're with you. We wish that we could be a little bit more hands-on with more of our favorite tasting components. Okay, at this point, I'm going to end the recording and thank all of you for being a part of our class today. In just a few days, by Friday, you'll be receiving the recorded version of this class. You'll get the link to where to find it on YouTube. You'll also then have our contact information in case you have further questions to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.